So we were talking about the government's conscience, the United States Constitution. We briefly touched on Republican government, and now we are moving on to other components, starting on page 30. Heading: Separation of Powers. In addition to dividing up the country into mini republics, reading this now, I realize I did not actually talk earlier about the mini republics concept. But not only is the United States government a republic, but each state is its own republic. Not only that, each state is its own constitutional republic. Each state has its own constitution, its own laws for governing and constraining the powers of state government, just like the country as a whole has the US Constitution for that purpose. And we could even go further and discuss how there are regional governments, county governments, city governments, town governments, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, in addition to dividing up the country into many republics, each part of government originally had to try to please different groups of people. A lot of thought went into the division of the legislative branch alone in the US Constitution. Rejected was the idea that the House of Representatives, the quote lower house, should elect the members of the US Senate, the quote upper house, and that the head of the executive branch, the president, should be selected by the legislative branch. Even though that is how many, quote, Western democracies operate today, our founders did not want to operate that way. Our founders rejected even that kind of democracy because they understood that if they did not reject that model, not only would this indeed give more voting power to the larger states, but the political majority of the nation could conceivably manipulate itself into permanently controlling all three branches, legislative, executive, and judicial, leading to the tyranny of the majority the founders were trying to avoid. With a separation of powers, no self-interested majority could possibly trample the rights of the political minority, because the majority and minority portions of the population would shift depending on the power base. While members of the U.S. House of Representatives are elected by citizens of their districts, members of the U.S. Senate were originally chosen by their state legislatures, further dividing the state into even smaller republics. Oh, there it is. However, even though U.S. senators are now elected by citizens within their state, they must appeal to the entire state, not to the concerns of a single district or region therein. Unfortunately for the less populous states of Alaska, Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Vermont, and Delaware, who have only one U.S. House representative, these constituencies, those for U.S. House and U.S. Senate, are exactly the same. Thus, for these 7 states, the new method of electing U.S. senators derails the separation of powers and consolidates power in the hands of the majority, at least in how they are represented in Washington, D.C. So for these less populous states, their governance in practice, at the national level at least, is much more closely aligned with the true design of democracy than the more populous states, more closely aligned with the true design of democracy than a republic. So unlike the innate understanding of the notion that democracy has to do with bigger numbers, in our constitutional federal republic, the states with the lowest number of residents are actually closer to living in a democracy than those states with bigger populations. Okay, so now what about that president? The US president, by design, is not chosen through a nationwide popular vote. This too would be much too close to majoritarian democracy for comfort. Instead, the President of the United States is elected by the Electoral College, which is an element of federalism also on this list. While others may argue that this mechanism was introduced because the common man was not politically educated enough to allow for a popular vote, that is not the case. The U.S. Constitution is very clear that all elections are supposed to be local, even for the single office that represents the entire nation. And while this chapter does not address all the reasons why the Electoral College makes sense, this ensures not only that representation remains geographically grounded, but that the bases of power are again distributed away from a centralization of power into an all-powerful sovereign ready and able to impose its will on all the people. Now, separation of powers in the context I use in this book is about power bases, but powers of each segment of government were also separated. Presidential power is, or was at least at one time, not the same as legislative powers. Likewise, the power of the judiciary was supposed to be completely different from the powers of both the president and the executive branch, and of those of the powers of the legislative branch. So the design of a constitution, an artificial conscience of government, first included separation of government powers and a separation between the bases of power for each of those segments. But many Americans confuse separation of power with its opposite, but just as important to the artificial conscience component of intertwined responsibilities. But I'm getting ahead of myself just a little bit, because lastly, federal judges are not elected at all, but appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. This was intended to ensure nomination and confirmation of level heads and even hands instead of political party or ideology. Oh, there is so much I could say here, but I think I'll save it for the next chapter. And the method for selecting federal judges also crosses over into the next component, intertwined responsibilities. Heading: intertwined responsibilities, checks and balances. There are several government actions that require approval from more than one body. For example, neither the Senate nor the House can act alone in passing legislation. And even once passed, the president can sign or veto the legislation. The president requires approval from the Senate to go to war, to enter into treaties, and to appoint a cabinet and all federal judges. This slows down the process, allows for debate and deliberation, and provides opportunities for parts of government, each beholden to a different power base, to step in and check the powers of another part or branch of government. This aspect was indeed intended as one of the most powerful expressions of an artificial conscience placed on government. I should probably save whatever I have to say here for the next chapter as well, but the point is gridlock. The point is gridlock. Gridlock was never supposed to be avoided to more quickly implement the general will or the will of the people. No, gridlock was the purpose behind setting up the government this way. And because there was supposed to be something of an inverse relationship between powers, between the different government entities, one branch or part of the government, even in their own quest for power, would find it in their own interest to limit the power of a competing government entity, or at least balance out that power by imposing their own. For example, if the president is consolidating power and then using it to commit crimes against the people, Congress has the obligation to impeach and hold the office accountable. If Congress oversteps its bounds and starts imposing legislation that seeks to take liberties away from the people, the president is obligated to veto such legislation to protect inherent rights and liberties. I'm going to quickly finish up the chapter with no more commentary, because I think if I wait, all my commentary will be better suited for the next chapter. So, heading: requirement for supermajorities in some cases. Requiring a 2/3 majority or 3/5 majority instead of a simple 50% plus 1 majority is just one small piece of the conscience. Requiring a supermajority means it is going to take extra convincing of the self, the collective body politic, to make a decision to act. Examples include overriding a veto, refer back to above, and affirming treaties in the Senate. This measure was also written into Senate rules with the filibuster to prevent a simple majority from making decisions, even within the representative democracy found in the House and Senate. Likewise, To amend the Constitution takes an even larger 3/4 majority of either of both houses or of the states themselves, found in Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution. Heading: Federalism. Defined as a sharing of powers between the national government and that of the states, federalism was intended to not only protect states' rights, but also to ensure the decentralization of power. Having many layers of government also provides multiple opportunities for debate and deliberation, which causes a delay in decision making, thus providing extra time for the conscience to kick in. Whereas Rousseau's sovereign government expresses the general will through a vote with no deliberation or debate, the elements of the US Republic force debate and deliberation at several levels, from the individual to the city, to the county, to the region, to the state, to the national stage. And even at the national level, the debate and deliberation must continue to ensure a broad and sustained support for any government action. And all that debate and deliberation was supposed to encourage those in power to feel the pull of the transcendent, to do what was in the actual benefit of the country instead of their own immediate benefit, to protect natural rights, align legislation with natural law, to reject evil that appeared to be good at the outset. At least that was how this artificial conscience was supposed to work. And that is what was new. This was the experiment. Not only a recognition of natural law and natural rights, not only the codification of a recognition of those rights, not only the codification of the purpose of government to protect those rights, but a codification of an ethical conscience for the body politic to increase the likelihood the government would do its one and only job, protect the rights of its people. And this could only work with such a complex conscience that gave government enough power to protect natural rights, but not enough power to take them away. Those in power must also be subject to the law and judged according to it. They were supposed to be subject to a moral self-examination of their own. So what do you think? Is that artificial conscience still at work? Are those in power subject to the law and judged according to it? Are they subjecting themselves to a moral self-examination of how they're governing? Before going on to chapter 4, tell me what you think.